3 people heard it. They were in different parts of the pavilion, at different distances from Jim Jones, and they did not speak to each other that night or for years afterward. But when researchers found them separately, one in 1981, one in 1989, one in 2003, and asked them to describe what they remembered from the final hours in Jonestown, all 3 of them mentioned the same moment without being prompted. They mentioned it before they mentioned the VATS, before they mentioned the gunshots from the airstrip, before they mentioned the children. They mentioned the moment, approximately 40 minutes before Jones gave the order, when Jim Jones said a name that none of the 3 witnesses had ever heard before, pressed his face into his hands, and wept. Not performed grief. Every person who had been in People's Temple long enough had seen Jones perform grief, had seen the theatrical weeping that he deployed during services to demonstrate the depth of his feeling. This was different. The 3 witnesses, separated by years and by geography and by the entirely different lives they had built after surviving Jonestown, used the same word to describe it. They said it was private. A private grief, in a public place, at the moment when everything was ending. And the name he said before he wept, the name that preceded the only moment of apparent authenticity that any witness recorded from Jim Jones on the last night of his life, has never been publicly identified. If you have ever wanted to understand not just what Jim Jones was but who he might have been before he became what he was, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because that name, and what it might mean, is the question this video exists to ask, not to answer. Some questions about Jim Jones do not have clean answers, but they have to be asked. Go back further than Jonestown. Go back further than People's Temple. Go back to Lynn, Indiana, in the 1930s, where James Warren Jones was born in 1931 to a father who was largely absent and a mother who was, by every account, extraordinary, fierce, political, unconventional, a woman who dressed her son in ways that made him a target and taught him, by example, that being a target was not the same as being wrong. Jones's childhood has been documented extensively, and the documentation produces a portrait that is consistent across sources. A boy who was isolated, who found his community in the church rather than at school, who began preaching to neighborhood children at an age when most children were playing, who had, from very early, the gift that would define and ultimately destroy everything he touched, the gift of making people feel seen, of knowing, without being told, what a person needed to hear, of filling the space between himself and another person with something that felt like understanding. What the documentation of Jones's childhood does not produce, what no biography, no congressional inquiry, no journalistic investigation has ever fully recovered, is a clear picture of his interior life before the gift took over, before he became the performance. There are glimpses. A teacher in Lynn who remembered him as a boy who cried easily and was embarrassed by it. A neighbor who described him sitting alone on a porch for hours, not reading, not playing, just sitting. A childhood friend, one of the very few people from Jones's early years who agreed to speak on record to researchers, who said that Jones, as a boy of 10 or 11, had spoken about someone he missed. A person from before his family moved to Lynn. Someone he had known briefly and lost track of and thought about often. The childhood friend could not remember the name. He said Jones had mentioned it once, and only once, and had not seemed to want to talk about it further, and that he had the impression, even as a child, that this was something Jones kept very private, something that did not belong to the public version of Jim Jones that was already, at age 10 or 11, beginning to form. The 3 witnesses who heard Jones say the name on the night of November 18, 1978, were interviewed separately and their accounts were never combined into a single published document. They exist in different archives, attached to different research projects, cited in different footnotes. Assembling them required years of work by a historian named Patricia Chung, who spent a decade after Jonestown reconstructing the final hours in the pavilion from survivor testimony. Chung, who published her findings in a limited academic monograph in 1994 that was never widely circulated, described the process of finding the 3 witnesses as the most difficult research she had ever conducted. Not because the witnesses were unwilling to talk, because the thing they were describing was so far outside the established narrative of who Jim Jones was that she initially dismissed it as false memory. The kind of confabulation that trauma produces, where the mind fills gaps in recollection with material that feels real but is not. She did not dismiss it for long, because the 3 accounts, assembled together, were too specific and too consistent to be confabulation. The witnesses agreed on the timing, approximately 40 minutes before the order was given. They agreed on the posture, Jones seated, face in hands, not standing at the microphone. They agreed on the quality of the sound, not loud, not theatrical, the opposite of the way Jones usually expressed emotion in public. And they agreed, all 3 of them, that the name he said was a first name only, a short name, and that it was not the name of anyone they recognized from People's Temple or from Jones's public life. One witness thought it sounded like a woman's name. One witness was not sure. The 3rd witness, who had been closer to Jones than the other 2 and who Chung describes as the most reliable of the 3, said it was definitely a woman's name and that Jones said it twice, once before he pressed his face into his hands and once, very quietly, after he lifted his face again. The third witness said, he looked, in that moment, like someone who was saying goodbye to something he had never said goodbye to properly. Like there was something unfinished, something he had been carrying for a long time that he knew, in that moment, he was never going to be able to put down. Chung spent 3 years trying to identify the name. She had one phonetic clue from the third witness, a single syllable, possibly beginning with a consonant. The witness was not certain. She went through Jones's personal correspondence, which is held in the California Historical Society and which runs to several thousand pages. She found no name matching the description. She went through the membership records of the churches Jones had attended and led in his childhood and adolescence in Indiana. She found no name matching the description. She interviewed every surviving member of Jones's extended family who would agree to speak with her. None of them recognized the name as she described it. She interviewed former members of People's Temple who had known Jones in the 1950s and 60s, before the organization grew large enough to create the distance between Jones and his congregation that characterized the later years. None of them had heard the name. She found one thing, in a box of Jones's personal effects that had been returned to his family after his death, and that his son Stephen Jones, the only biological child of Jim and Marceline Jones, who survived Jonestown because he was playing in a basketball tournament in Georgetown, had donated to the California Historical Society in the 1990s. There was a small notebook. The notebook was not indexed in the archives catalog. It had been filed with a group of miscellaneous personal items and had not been examined closely by any researcher before Chung found it. It was mostly empty, but on the third page, in handwriting that Stephen Jones confirmed was his father's, there were 4 lines. No date, no context, just 4 lines, written at some point in a life that spanned from 1931 to 1978, in a hand that Chung describes as different from the handwriting in Jones's official correspondence, smaller, slower, the handwriting of someone writing privately rather than productively. The 4 lines read, I have tried to love everyone. I have not always succeeded. There is one I could not reach. There is one I never stopped trying to reach. No name, no explanation, just 4 lines and the blank pages that followed them. Chung published her account of the notebook in the 1994 monograph. She was careful to note that she could not establish when the lines were written, could not connect them definitively to the name the witnesses heard in the pavilion, could not claim with certainty that the unidentified one of the 4 lines was the same person as the unidentified name spoken on the last night. She was a careful historian. She said what the evidence allowed her to say and no more. But in the final paragraph of the monograph, which is, in the judgment of everyone who has read it, the most honest and most unsettling thing written about Jim Jones by anyone who approached him through the evidence rather than through ideology, she wrote something that has stayed with every researcher who has encountered it since. She wrote, what the witnesses describe, and what the notebook suggests, is the possibility that Jim Jones spent his entire adult life building something enormous. A community, a movement, a theology, a system of control, in the service of something very small. A private grief, a person he could not reach. A failure of love so early and so complete that he spent 30 years trying to compensate for it at scale, giving to 900 people what he had not been able to give to one. This is speculation. The evidence does not prove it. But it is the speculation that the evidence points toward, and I have spent 10 years with this material and I cannot find a different direction that the evidence points. If it is true, if the movement and the manipulation and the final catastrophe were all, at their root, an attempt to solve something that could not be solved at that scale, then what Jonestown represents is not the story of a man who wanted power. It is the story of a man who wanted one thing and built an entire world trying to find it and never did. And the name he said in the pavilion, 40 minutes before the end, was the name of that thing, the thing he had been building toward all along, the thing he was saying goodbye to when there was nothing left to say goodbye to except everything. The name has never been identified. Chung died in 2007 without finding it. The 3 witnesses are all dead. Stephen Jones, who read the monograph after its publication and who reached out to Chung before her death, said in a letter that she shared in her papers that he did not know the name either. He said he had thought about it for years. He said his father was not a man who showed what he kept private. He said there were rooms inside Jim Jones that no one was allowed into, not Marceline, not the inner circle, not the congregation of 900 people who believed they knew him. He said, I grew up with him and I did not know him. I think that was true of everyone. I think the person he kept most hidden was himself. And I think whatever he said in that pavilion, at the end, was addressed to the part of himself he had kept hidden longest. I don't know what that means. I have been trying to understand it for 30 years. I don't think I'm going to get there. The notebook is in the California Historical Society. The 4 lines are on the 3rd page. The name is not there. It was never written down, in any document, in any archive, by any hand. It existed only in the moment Jones said it, in the pavilion, 40 minutes before the end, in a voice that 3 witnesses described as private, as something that was not meant to be heard, as the sound of a man putting down, at the very last moment, the one thing he had never been able to put down, and then picking back up the microphone, and finishing what he had started, and taking 918 people with him into the silence that followed. We do not know the name. We know it was said. We know it was the last private thing Jim Jones ever expressed in a life that had almost no private things left in it by the end. We know that 3 people heard it and remembered it before everything else. We know that it preceded the only tears any witness described as real, and we know that it is still unidentified, still sitting in the gap between what the evidence shows and what the evidence explains, still the most human and most inexplicable detail in a story that has been examined from every possible angle for nearly 50 years. A name, 1 syllable, said twice, in the pavilion, 40 minutes before the end, by a man who had spent his whole life making sure no one could see inside him, and who, at the very last moment, could not help it. There is something that Patricia Chung wrote in her private research notes, not in the monograph, but in the notebooks she kept during the 10 years she spent on the project. In an entry from the summer of 1991 she wrote about what she called the central paradox of Jim Jones. She wrote, "The more I learn about what he did, the more I understand the mechanism. The psychology is not mysterious. The control techniques are documented and replicable. What I cannot understand, what the mechanism does not explain, is the cost. The personal cost. The man was not unfeeling. The evidence suggests he felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply, and that the mechanism he built was not the expression of his feeling but the management of it. A way of controlling the feeling by making it larger, by scaling it up until it was no longer personal, no longer about one person or one failure or one name, but about all of humanity, about a mission so large that the original wound became invisible. This is the thing I cannot prove but cannot stop believing, that Jonestown was, at its root, a wound, that 918 people died inside someone else's wound, and that the man who built it never found what he was looking for, not once, not even at the end, especially not at the end." She crossed out the last 3 sentences and then wrote them again below. Then she closed the notebook. The next entry is from 2 weeks later and is about archival methodology. She never returned to the subject, but she kept the crossed-out sentences. She left them there, crossed out and rewritten, in a notebook not meant to be read by anyone, which is perhaps the most honest thing ever written about Jim Jones. Not in a published account, but in private, by a woman who had spent years trying to understand something and arrived at a conclusion she could not prove and could not abandon. The wound, the name, the 40 minutes before the end, the private grief in a public place at the moment when everything was ending. These are the things the evidence points toward and cannot confirm. These are the things that live in the gap between what is known and what is understood, between the name he said in the pavilion and the silence that followed, between the man 918 people believed they knew and the man who stood in front of a mirror in a room behind a stage, trying to remember something he had decided, long ago, he could afford to lose. He could not afford to lose it. That is what the evidence suggests. That the thing he had carried from a childhood in Indiana through 4 decades of building and breaking and finally catastrophe. That thing, whatever it was, whoever it belonged to, whatever name it answered to, was not something he had ever managed to put down. Was not something the community of 900 had replaced. Was not something the power or the certainty or the pharmaceutical management or the performance had touched. It was still there. It was still there at the end, when everything else had been stripped away, when the vats were positioned and the order was minutes from being given and there was nothing left to manage and nothing left to perform. It was still there. He said its name. He wept. He lifted his face. He picked up the microphone. And he did not say it again. We do not know what it was. We know it was real. In a life that contained very little that was real by the end. In a final hour documented from every angle, examined for 50 years, the most real thing anyone recorded was a name, said privately, heard by 3 people in different parts of a pavilion who did not know each other, never compared notes, and still remembered the same moment before anything else. A name, 1 syllable, said twice in the dark, in the pavilion, 40 minutes before the end. The only private thing left. Stephen Jones gave one long interview in 2015, on the occasion of the publication of a new book about Jonestown, in which he was asked directly about Chung's monograph and about the name. He said he had read the monograph more than once. He said he thought Chung had gotten closer to his father than anyone else who had tried. He said, she understood that the question was not what he did. The question was what he was trying to do, what he thought he was building. And I think she was right that he was trying to build something that would fill a space that he could never fill by himself. I don't know if that makes him more human or less. I think it makes him both. I think he was the most human person I ever knew, in the sense of being broken in a way that every person is broken. And I think he was the least human person I ever knew in what he did with the brokenness. He used it, he made it into something, and 918 people died inside it, including my mother. And I have spent my whole life trying to understand how both of those things can be true at the same time, and I don't have an answer, and I don't think I'm going to get one. He paused for a long time. Then he said, I think the name was real. I think it was someone he loved before he knew how to love at scale, before he learned to do it for crowds, before the gift took over. I think it was someone from before all of that, and I think he never got over not being able to reach them. I think that's what he was doing, the whole time, trying to reach them, through all of us.